We shall have order in the court, order. Now let's turn our attention to Law Statute 84 of 562 and discuss the merits of this case. The legal system is a complicated topic with a myriad of laws that come from times long past and sometimes have little relevance or seem to have little relevance on what we do today, but those laws still exist on the books. But laws in a fantasy world can sometimes seem even more arbitrary, made up and without relevance to what the characters are doing. So today, let's talk a little bit about how to develop a system of laws that both feels organic and gives you all kinds of plot elements and thematic tones that you can play with as both a writer and an author. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you have not yet done so, please do hit the subscribe button down below. And if you'd like to join my community of world builders, a link to the Discord server is in the description of this video. Okay, let's get cracking. First, let's talk about the spread of law. The written law is inherently more enduring than a verbal tradition of laws. A great example of this comes to us from the Judeo-Christian tradition, where the Kingdom of Judea wrote down the law, as I said in my video on the written word. And because they wrote down the law, their point of view, their interpretation of the laws of Judaism trumped the Israel kingdom. By the same token, the Brehon judges of the Celtic tradition in Ireland did not write down their laws. Their laws were passed down from one generation to the next in a verbal tradition. And today, we know less about their laws than we do about the Judeo-Christian laws, despite the fact that the Celtic Brehons were active until well into the Middle Ages, whereas the written law that comes from the Judeo tradition was written well before the birth of Christ, more than 2,000 years ago. So if you write down your laws, they are much more likely to endure and hence much more likely to have an impact on the characters of your world at a later time. Okay, so much for writing down your law versus speaking your law. But what actually should you govern by law? What laws are important for your society to be a functional society? You can largely divide law into a couple of categories. The first of which I call community and well-being laws. Laws that govern things like what is a legal marriage? How do people get divorced if they want to split up? What happens to children? How is inheritance passed from one generation to the next? These laws also govern things like how many people may gather in a specific place. Are you allowed to protest? Are you allowed to strike? May you distribute subversive literature amongst the population? All of these are elements of building the kind of community and society that you want to govern. And of course, they have a very big impact on what your community is like. If you have stringent laws around the spread of information, you will have a society that feels suppressed, a society that feels as though there's constantly a big brother watching them. Now, maybe that's what you're aiming for. In that case, lay on the community laws and make them as harsh and as strict as possible. 1984 is a great example of this, with double think and double speak and needing to replace words in your mind and erase certain categories, and the daily litany of hate that you speak towards the faction that your government opposes. All of these are elements of community well-being. Of course, the community that is created in 1984 is not a very healthy community at all, but that doesn't change the fact that these laws are about that community. The second category that I want to talk about is safety, or who is allowed to administrate violence. So you can see that this can make quite a difference. For example, under Celtic law, there were the brehons who were appointed by the Tuathas. Now, the Tuathas was the basic political unit in Ireland, and any free man could belong to a Tuatha. You could apply to join a Tuatha. The Tuathas would gather annually and appoint brehons, judges, and kings to lead them and make any changes to the law. War couldn't be declared without a Tuatha gathering to declare war, and this meant that the Tuatha were what governed the application of violence, and they appointed the brehons who governed internal application of violence, and this was how they maintained the safety of their community. On the other hand, during the Middle Ages, when the rise of kings became more prominent within Europe, the king and his court governed both internal and external application of violence, with some application of the Roman Catholic Church, which brings up a very interesting point of law, which is the local laws or state laws versus federal laws, as they would say in the United States in this day and age. But if you look at Europe, you can very clearly see that kind of model as well, with the church law versus the country's laws. And specifically, this of course was the source of much contention when it came to the divorce of Henry VIII, where he wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't grant it to him under church law. And eventually, he founded his own church and seceded from the Roman Catholic Church in order to have his own divorce laws, in order to have his nation's laws be supreme over the federal laws, over the church's laws. So it's a very interesting model to approach from that angle, the federal versus the local laws. And remember, it doesn't have to be actually federal. It can be something like a United Nations body or a European Union body or even a church body. But back to safety and the application of violence. So under the Middle Age laws, it was more that the king was the arbitrator of violence. And that, of course, gave him also internal rights to apply violence in terms of a police force. So we've spoken about community and safety, but there is also property and trade laws. Now, property and trade laws govern who owns what, and this makes a massive difference to your society. If you do not have private ownership, if you only have collective ownership, then your society's approach to goods and items and pieces of land is going to be vastly different from if a person can own a piece of land. The Russian model of farming was always a collective one. So the lands around the village was farmed communally by the peasants living in that village, and the village elders would dictate what crops were grown in any given year. Of course, this contrasts quite sharply with a more private model of ownership where a person owns the land and they work it. And then, of course, there is feudalism, where the king owns the land and he allows the nobles to work it in return for them giving him a part of their produce, and they in turn allow the peasants to work it in return for a part of their produce, or in return for their military assistance, or in return for being kept safe. The long and the short of it is that you can also have a model of ownership where the land is actually owned by one individual or by something like the church, and everybody else is only sharecroppers on the land, and that can be a part of your property law. Also be aware that under this obviously forms owning people, which in our sad history as humans we have very frequently engaged in. Everything from debt slavery to chattel slavery to serfdom. Those three models are distinguished by serfdom. The person cannot be sold, but they are not allowed to move away from the land. They are part and parcel of the land, like a building that is built on the land. They are a fixture of the land. Chattel slavery is where somebody is regarded in the same light as an animal. They are bought and sold and cannot move from being a slave. This is probably one of the most heinous things you can do to a person. Debt slavery or contract slavery is where somebody is set into a contract that they cannot move out of, and their rights as a person is either vastly reduced or rendered null and void by the contract under which they exist, and that contract, and hence their labor, can be bought and sold. If you do include them in your world, you should be aware that these are very harsh things, and they will have a harsh impact on your society. By its nature, your society will become a colder and more ruthless one if you have laws that turn people into property. Speaking of sensitive topics, colonialization will also affect your laws. So what happens when a country is colonized is the laws of the native population are suppressed, and the laws of the colonizer become applied to that community. Sometimes it is even so that the laws of the colonizer are made harsher in the community that they have colonized. But sometimes the laws of those who are colonized begin to influence the laws of the colonizer, and you end up with a kind of mishmash of laws of the two working in conjunction. This is especially relevant if a country is colonized and then manages to overthrow the colonizer and take back their country. And you can see this in action in many of the African nation states, where tribes have been thrown together by colonization and their tribal laws were suppressed by the colonizers from Europe. But in due course, as they fought for and gained their freedoms, those laws changed. Now, in many cases, they did adopt the colonizers' laws, the laws coming from Europe, but they also reintroduced some of the tribal law of Africa, resulting in some very interesting legal models as they adapt to combining their traditions with the traditions introduced by the European colonizers. So if you're looking to make your legal system a very interesting mishmash of multiple traditions, it is worth looking into whether there was one nation state in your world that engaged in colonization and therefore spread their legal system where it was adapted into different models by those that they colonized. This, however, is fantasy world building. So what about magical laws? So here you need to be very aware of the effect that magic has. How can magic be policed? You would need either to have people who are immune to magic, or people who can counter magic, or mages themselves policing magic. Also, magic might very well be treated like a weapon. So it could be that you need to be licensed to use your magic. Or it could be that you need to be a member of the church to use magic, or some other mechanic that allows the state to control this very wild card effect, as I spoke about in my video about politics and magic making a volatile mix. So bear that in mind when you're designing your magic system and when you're designing your world. If a lot of people have magic, there will be laws governing it. And those laws will be about the state either controlling magic or about mages being in control of the state in a typical magocracy, which is what could very well happen if magic gave your people a material advantage. So if the magic is powerful enough to influence people's strength, they could use that strength to take over the government and run the country. So in the case where you're drawing up magic laws, I would either go for magic is strictly controlled, or I would take the approach of magic is the law. Of course, you could also go for magic is so common that it is like running fast. Yes, there are people like Usain Bolt who can run faster than others, but everybody can run. So in that case, there wouldn't be specifically laws governing it beyond the general laws of the country. And those are my thoughts on creating a legal history and a legal framework within a fantasy world, things to think about, categories into which to divide your laws, and considerations for magic. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Please do hit the thumbs up button if you have. If you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page or buy my book, links to both in the description down below. And I suggest that you check out my video on enforcing the law in a fantasy world, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.